I would like to talk to you about being blind to the purpose. God has purposes for us that we cannot see. I think, and if we could see it, we'd get nervous. So often we are blind with our eyes open, wide open. You would think we could see it, but we can't. Peter said he was brave, he was loyal, he was faithful. And Jesus looked at him and said, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times in just a few hours by the time the rooster crows. He couldn't see that. Sometimes we just can't see who we are. We think we know who we are, but we really don't. I grew up being quiet and shy. I still am. But I used to think that being quiet and shy was a weakness. I don't think of it as a weakness anymore. You know what they say, you got to watch out for those quiet ones? Lot looked at Sodom and Gomorrah. He looked at the plains of the field, and he saw incredible opportunities for success. And that's the place where he went bankrupt. Because we really can't see. So many things that we are blind to. Now in John, the 9th chapter, there's an interesting story about a blind man who actually teaches us to see. Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a blind man who was born blind, which means he never saw the light. He never saw color. All of his life, complete darkness. He was born that way. And that's the man that helps us open up our eyes, which I'd like to share with you. While Jesus was looking at this man, the disciples asked Jesus, saying, Rabbi, who sinned? Somehow the disciples are looking for the dirt. Who sinned? This man or his parents that he was born blind? Which was a silly question. But I want to point out something. I want to point out the fact that he was blind, not deaf. They're standing in front of a blind man, and they're talking about who sinned. Did he sin? What sin did he commit? Or was it the sin of his parents? Isn't it interesting that sometimes people can be so blind by the sensitivities of other people? Tactless. Disciples are talking about dirt in front of a man who was born blind. Like Job's comforters, God said at the very beginning of Job that he was blameless and righteous, and Job's comforters come along when he is sick, and it said, your sin, that's it, yes, sin is creating the punishment that you're in. Totally blind to what God sees. Some people are just blind. The disciples can't see it. And Jesus answers it and says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Now, if Jesus would have stopped there, we'd say, okay, Jesus took care of that problem. But Jesus goes one step further. He says, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. And that sounds like Jesus took a bad situation and just made it worse. Because when you think in terms of this man being blind because God had a plan for him, if something rubs us the wrong way. What do you mean? Wait a minute. The man was born blind, but you had a purpose in the fact that he was blind, so he had to live his life being blind because of today. Today something wonderful is going to happen, and he paid the price, and today, that's what it sounded like Jesus was saying. And that is what Jesus said. The reason is because we are absolutely blind when it comes to the purposes of God. We can't see them. We do not know. We would like to know. And sometimes teaching leads us to believe that whatever your hand finds to do is going to turn out to be wonderful. And the truth of the matter is that sometimes we find ourselves in valleys that are not that wonderful, and sometimes we find ourselves climbing mountains that are not that wonderful. And so we wonder to ourselves, Lord, what's the purpose? What's the purpose in all of this? Nancy Ann was preparing for a ladies' retreat some time ago, and she left on the table some of her work, and I was reading it. And one of the passages that she had was Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1. And I started reading some of the information that she had, and a thought came to me. In that first verse of a third chapter, that there's a reason for everything under the sun. Now, Jesus says something interesting. He says, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. But you know, that sounds strange because he's standing in front of a blind man who has never, ever seen light. And he says, I am the light of the world. You know, sometimes we witness to somebody and they just don't see it. They don't get it. We talk about how wonderful Jesus is and they don't understand it. And we shouldn't feel bad about it because they're blind. They can't see. Jesus is the light of the world. And no matter how much we try to talk about who Jesus is, unless the Holy Spirit reveals Jesus to them, they will go on from day to day to be blind. So I'm reading in Ecclesiastes 3:1, to everything there is a season. And I was thinking about season. You know, a child is born and a child goes to childhood. Childhood. That's the child's season. We can't expect a child to understand adulthood because they're in the season of a child. Then the child becomes a youth. And we can't expect the youth to understand adulthood because they're in the season of youth. And then they become adults. And when they become an adult, sometimes we hear people say, why don't you act your age? Because sometimes adults act like kids. But adulthood is a season. So we go through seasons to everything, childhood, youth, adulthood. There is a season for everything. But the next part of that verse really got my attention. A time for every purpose under heaven. It sounds so radical. Because I could think of a lot of purposes that would not be connected to heaven. But Solomon said, there's a time for every purpose under heaven. It's hard to see. We can't see it. We are blind to it. We're like that blind man. We cannot see. And so we go by faith. Because it's a faith walk. It'd be wonderful if we can go by sight, but we can't go by sight because we walk by faith. So there's a purpose for everything under the sun, but we don't know what that purpose is. And I give you an illustration. Naomi, she left Bethlehem because there was a famine in Bethlehem with her husband, and they moved to Moab. And when they got to Moab, her sons married 2 Moabite women. And during that period of time, her husband and both sons died. She became bitter. What does this all mean? I left Bethlehem because there was a famine. I came to Moab because there was prosperity, but I discovered that in prosperity, there was an incredible famine. I lost my husband and 2 sons, and all she was left with was a daughter-in-law, Ruth. And she moved back to Bethlehem, a bitter woman. She said, don't call me Naomi anymore. I'm now bitter. She gets to Bethlehem, and we know the story because we read the book. Naomi's daughter-in-law marries Boaz. They have a child. It's Obed. Child grows up, gets married, has a child, Jesse. Jesse has a son, David, who becomes the king of Israel. So many years passed by from the time that Naomi and Ruth moved back to Bethlehem. So many years, generations go by before you could begin to see the purpose. Because Jesus is known as the son of David. And Ruth is in the lineage of Jesus. So way back there, when it seemed like there was no purpose and only tragedy, God was working out a plan beyond our ability to understand, because we cannot see the purposes of God. We are blind to them, but he was working out something that was incredible. And this is what it means. It means you're going through stuff. We all go through stuff. We have no idea what the purpose is. We try to figure it out, but we can't figure out the purpose. And it could be generations before the purpose actually becomes visible. So that's what we do. What we do is we walk by faith, believing what might be hard to believe, because God has a purpose in what I'm going through. Even if I don't understand it, I may be blind to it, but there's a purpose, because the book says, to everything under heaven, God's got a purpose. He's working out something in our lives when we don't even know what's going on. If I told you the story, if I just told you the story, that a boy was born. He was born and his father loved him. So far the story is wonderful. But his brothers hated him because his father loved him too much. And now you figured out who this boy is. And then this boy had dreams. He had dreams that he was going to be great and God was going to do some wonderful things to him, and his brothers hated him even more. And they sold him into slavery. And if you were Joseph, you got to be asking yourself, what's the purpose of this? I got a dream that I'm going to be a leader, but now I am a slave in Potiphar's house. I don't see the purpose in this. And on top of that, he gets thrown into jail for crime he didn't commit, and he's pacing back and forth for over 2 years in jail, wondering, what is the purpose? If you did not read the story and did not know the end of the story, you would never know the purpose of God. It would not make sense. But the day came when Joseph spoke to his brothers and said, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. He had a purpose. Sometimes we're in the sense in Joseph's sandals. 17 years are going by and we don't understand what is going on. But God, who lives outside of time, knows what he's doing. Can I believe when I'm going through my valley that there's a purpose here, regardless of what I think? And what we find out is that Joseph was not a victim. He was a victor all the time. But it didn't look that way. The story of Jesus would be a total tragedy at the cross. If you stopped at the cross, and the disciples did, they stopped at the cross. Jesus died. Their hopes are gone. If it wasn't for Easter Sunday morning, they would have never known the purpose. But there's a purpose for everything under heaven. Everything. That's why there's that song that goes, don't be weary in doing good. Don't surrender in the fight. Keep on doing what you know is right, because God knows what he's doing. And it's going to be times when we question what it is God is doing. It's okay to question. We've got a lot of questions. But never lose the fact that behind all the questions, there is a purpose that God is working it out. Then, Jesus does something that is really strange. When Jesus had said these things, and what the things he said was, neither this man nor his parents have sinned, but that the works of God should be performed, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva. And he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. Anybody looking at this would have said, Jesus, to put mud on a blind man's eyes to make the problem worse. Who does that? And I know the skeptics would have been laughing. They would have been like that. What does mud got to do with it? Jesus thinks that mud is medicine. And the reason is because we are so blind to the ways of God that we cannot see purpose even when it's staring at us in the eye. What's mud got to do? I want to tell you about mud. I want to tell you how important mud is. To a blind person who's biting into a peach, the sweetness of that peach comes from the mud in the ground. And then there's another kind of sweetness that comes out of the dirt, which gives us the tangerine. And another kind of sweetness that gives us the tomato. And the same dirt will produce another kind of sweetness in the sweet corn. But if you take a handful of that dirt, put it in your mouth, there's nothing sweet about that dirt. Yet, out of that mud, not just comes sweetness, but the beautiful colors of the flowers and the different perfumes that come from flowers all come from the dirt. And we would never know. We can't see what's going on. We're blind to that. That doesn't change the fact that there's some power. And I don't need to add. But we read in Genesis 2, and out of the ground, out of the dirt, the Lord God made every tree grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And beyond that, he took dirt and he made and formed us. So before the critics come and they criticize Jesus for taking mud and put it into the blind man's eyes, we need to learn a little bit more about how God operates and what God is doing, because he's performing miracles before our very eyes every day, but we don't really see it because we're blind to it. Jesus said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." And to me, this is the strangest part of the whole story. Because we have the disciples being tactless when they say, who sinned, this man or his parents? And then Jesus is saying, no, neither him nor his parents. Jesus could have said, first of all, he was born blind. You think he sinned in his mother's womb? Come on. And then Jesus puts mud in his eyes and tells him to go wash it off. And Jesus said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And I could just hear the blind man say, you want me to go blind? You want me to trip and stumble to the pool? You touched me and I wasn't healed. Don't you think maybe you missed something, Jesus? Maybe if you touch me and heal me, then I can go and see where the pool is and wash it off. But it's interesting that Jesus doesn't heal him. Just puts mud in his eye and tells him to go blind. I wonder if Jesus is speaking to us and saying, I want you to go even though you're discouraged. Don't wait until you get encouraged. Don't wait until the numbers look good. Just go. So you're feeling down and you're feeling depressed. Go. You got to go even if you're alone. This man went alone. He's blind. He's going alone to the pool of Siloam. And sometimes we feel alone. Lord, I'm in this thing all alone. It'd be nice if I had some help here. But you're asking me to go and I'm alone? Go. Lord, if somebody stops me and asks me what I'm going to do, and I got mud in my eyes, and I'm telling them that you told me to go wash this thing off in the pool of Siloam, I am totally embarrassed. Did you know that God has no problem embarrassing us? None whatsoever. I'm going to have to talk to God about that when I get to heaven, because you know what? I don't really like to be embarrassed. But you must have a purpose in that. Yeah, there's a purpose, everything under heaven. So you're embarrassed for a reason. God told Abram, I'm changing your name to Abraham, father of many nations. Lord, I'm embarrassed. Because they're going to ask me how many kids I have. And not one child is born to my wife Sarah because she's barren. She's 90 years old and is barren. You are embarrassing me. And somehow God gets the glory out of Sarah's barrenness. 4,000 years later, we're still reading about it. And God gets the glory out of Jacob's limping. 4,000 years later, we're still reading about it. Because while he was limping, he was worshiping the Lord, leaning on his staff. The whole issue, Jesus is trying to teach his disciples way back when this blind man is seen. They say, God's going to get the glory out of this. We find that hard that God would allow this man to be blind, born blind, in order to get the glory. But I don't find it that hard because Paul was stoned and God got the glory out of that stoning, and Paul was shipwrecked. And 2,000 years later, we're still reading about it because God got the glory. And Paul said he was weak, but he discovered God's strength in his weakness, and somehow God gets the glory out of the areas where we are weak. And John is exiled on the island of Patmos. He could have been out there establishing churches, but he's thrown into exile, carrying rocks to the harbor. And he's 90. And God gets the glory. Everything's about God getting the glory. But I thought that God gets the glory out of the revival. I thought God gets the glory out of the healing. And I never thought about God getting the glory out of the difficulty that I've got to go through. I never thought about God saying, hooray, he's got a valley to go through. But somehow God gets the glory out of my valley. That blind man has something to teach us. He opens up our eyes. So he went and washed and came back seeing. He did what Jesus said. And his eyes were open. Later on, he meets Jesus personally, He didn't know that Jesus was the Son of God at the time. But he finds out that Jesus is the Son of God. It says, and the man who was blind worshipped him. I guess you could say that God gets the glory out of our worshiping him. When we set time aside to praise him, when we get into a Thanksgiving season and we find reasons to be thankful for, God's getting the glory. He always gets the glory. But I want to tell you, and I want to tell me something. For God to get the glory, it costs us something. It cost Naomi years grieving. It cost Joseph 17 years confused. It caused this blind man to be born blind. It costs when we face stuff. We all face stuff. And while we're facing that stuff, God's getting the glory. I never think of it that way. I always think about He gets the glory when I'm praising Him. He gets the glory when I'm struggling. Whether I'm disappointed or depressed or hurting or lonely or fighting, God's getting the glory. So I set some time aside and I said, Lord, I just want to thank you. I don't understand this. I don't understand a lot of stuff that I go through. Some of the stuff that I've gone through could have been avoided. So I want to praise you. Maybe somebody today is going through something that you need to take to this altar and say, Lord, I don't understand, but I'm coming. I'm going to come and I'm going to bring my hurt. I'm going to bring my confusion. I'm going to bring the pain that I carry. I'm going to bring the sorrow the cross that I'm carrying. I got to bring it. I want to bring it to the altar. I want to worship you, even if I don't understand. I don't need to understand. I do understand this. Everything under heaven has a purpose. And so there's got to be a purpose here somewhere. And I want to thank you for it. This altar is open. I'll be glad to pray with you as you come.